In a world that looked down on her, Hannah chose kindness. But when she fed Mama Martha, she had no idea she was saving the mother of the city's most powerful billionaire. What starts as a simple meal turns into a miracle that transforms a slum into a palace. But money isn't the only thing Adrian has to offer. He knows the truth about Hannah's missing husband. A story about faith, destiny, and how one plate of food can change the world. Grab your tissues. Hi, guys. It's your favorite folktale bestie. We bring you tales that touch the heart and shake the soul. Please hit that subscribe button to help our community grow. It really supports us to keep creating, and we love to know our family. Tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from today? Now let the truth unfold. The heat in the lower quarter was always heavy, but today it felt worse. Hannah stood behind her wooden stall, carefully stirring a large pot of tomato stew. She kept the lid partially closed to protect the food from the street, only lifting it to stir. It was the lunch rush, and the hungry workers were already lining up. "Ma, I'm here," a voice called out. Hannah looked up to see her son, Leo, dropping his school bag on a crate. He was 17 and tired, but he didn't complain. He simply rolled up the sleeves of his uniform and dipped his hands into a basin of soapy water. "You're late," Hannah said, though she smiled. "Teacher kept us," Leo replied, grabbing a stack of dirty plates. "But don't worry, I'm faster than the customers." They worked together quickly. Hannah served the rice and stew. Leo washed the plates and wiped the tables. They were a good team. They had to be, ever since Leo's father disappeared 3 years ago. Then the rhythm stopped. Mama Martha, the elderly homeless woman who wandered the district, shuffled near the edge of the stall. Her clothes were torn, her hair was matted, and she looked weak from hunger. She stood there silently, staring at the food but afraid to come closer. "Hey, get out of here!" a mechanic from the shop next door shouted at her. "You're scaring the customers away. Go!" Mama Martha flinched and turned to leave, her shoulders hunching in defeat. "Stop!" Hannah's voice was firm. She tapped her spoon against the metal pot to get their attention. "Mama Martha, come here." The mechanic shook his head and went back to work, muttering about how Hannah was too soft. Hannah ignored him. She didn't reach for the bucket of burnt rice or scraps. Instead, she took a clean plate. She scooped a large portion of hot rice and dug deep into the stew to find a piece of beef, a piece she could have sold for good money. "Sit in the shade, Mama Martha," Hannah said gently, handing her the food. "Eat slowly." Mama Martha took the plate with shaking hands. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears as she sat on a small stool in the corner, eating like it was her first meal in days. An hour later, the crowd was finally gone. Leo wiped his wet hands on a rag and walked over to the cooking pot. His stomach growled loudly. "Is there any left?" he asked, peering inside. "I'm starving." Hannah froze. She looked at the empty pot, then at Mama Martha, who was scraping the last grains of rice from her plate in the corner. She looked back at her son with a sinking feeling in her chest. "Leo," she said softly, "I gave the last piece of meat to Mama Martha. I forgot to save yours." Leo looked into the pot. All that was left was white rice and sauce. He looked at his mother's worried face, waiting for him to be upset. Then he looked at the old woman, resting peacefully in the shade. He didn't get angry. He didn't complain. He just grabbed a spoon and scooped the rice onto his plate. "It's okay, Ma," Leo said with a genuine smile, taking a bite. "I eat meat every day anyway." Leo had just finished his plain rice, scraping the plate clean, when the ground beneath him began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, deeper and smoother than the rattling engines of the local buses or the sputter of motorbikes. The noise grew louder, commanding the air, until 3 sleek, black SUVs turned the corner onto the potholed road. They moved like sharks through the dirty water of the street. Their windows were tinted so dark they looked like mirrors, reflecting the shocked faces of the market vendors. The cars were pristine, not a speck of dust on them, looking alien against the faded tin shacks and wooden stalls. "Pack up," the mechanic next door hissed, dropping his wrench. "It's the government. They're here for evictions again." Panic rippled through the street. Customers abandoned their meals and scattered. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him slightly behind her. "Stay close," she whispered, her instinct to protect kicking in immediately. But the cars didn't stop at the mechanic's shop or the intersection. They rolled slowly, purposefully, until they came to a halt directly in front of Hannah's humble food stand. The silence that followed was heavy. The engine of the lead car cut off. The click of the door unlocking sounded like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The back door of the middle SUV swung open. A man stepped out, and the air seemed to shift. He was tall, dressed in a navy blue suit that cost more than Hannah would earn in a lifetime. His shoes were polished leather, and a gold watch glinted on his wrist. Behind him, two large men with earpieces and stern faces exited the other vehicles, scanning the area like hawks. Hannah wiped her hands nervously on her apron, her breath catching in her throat. She expected him to ask for a permit or to tell her she was blocking the road. But the man didn't look at Hannah. He didn't look at Leo or the pot of stew or the frightened mechanic peeking out from his garage. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the stall under the shade of the tattered canopy. He walked past Hannah as if she were a ghost. His steps were slow, heavy with an emotion she couldn't place. He walked straight toward Mama Martha. Mama Martha stopped eating. She clutched a plate of rice to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. She shrank back against the wooden post, looking small and fragile. She looked like she expected to be struck. The man stopped 2 feet away from her. His polished shoes sank into the dust. He stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. His stern face crumpled. The authority and power seemed to melt away, leaving only a boy's grief. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, the billionaire dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the sharp stones or the dirt staining his expensive trousers. He knelt right there in the grime of the lower quarter. He reached out a trembling hand, hovering it near the old woman's face, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he touched her. Mama Martha blinked, her breathing shallow. The man's voice cracked, a broken whisper that carried across the silent market. "Mother?" The word hung in the air. Leo dropped the rag he was holding. Hannah covered her mouth with her hand. The entire street went deathly quiet, watching the impossible unfold in the dust. The word mother hung in the dusty air for a heartbeat, and then the spell broke. Mama Martha's eyes rolled back. The plastic plate slipped from her fingers, hitting the ground with dull thud as rice scattered across Adrian's polished shoes. She crumpled forward. "No, Mama!" Adrian cried out, catching her frail body before she hit the dirt. "Medic!" he roared, his voice cracking with panic. The security guards sprang into action, shouting into their radios. One of the SUVs reversed, screeching to the front. Hannah rushed forward instinctively, her hand reaching out, but guard blocked her path with a massive arm. "Let them through." Adrian barked, lifting his unconscious mother into his arms effortlessly. He looked at Hannah, his eyes wild and pleading. "You and the boy, come with us." "Us?" Hannah stammered, shrinking back. "Sir, we are just—" "She doesn't know me." Adrian's voice was desperate. "She knows you. If she wakes up surrounded by strangers, the shock could kill her. Please." Hannah looked at Leo. He nodded silently. Without untying her apron, Hannah grabbed Leo's hand, and they climbed into the back of the leather-scented SUV, leaving the stunned market behind. The drive was a blur of sirens and speed. 20 minutes later, they were standing in the VIP wing of St. Jude's Medical Center. The silence here was different from the market. It was cold, sterile, and expensive. The floors were marble, reflecting the bright fluorescent lights. Hannah crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly painfully aware of the red palm oil stains on her apron and the smell of charcoal smoke clinging to her hair. Leo tried to smooth his rumpled school uniform, looking at the pristine white walls as if he were afraid to touch them. Nurses in crisp blue scrubs had whisked Mama Martha away on a stretcher. Now, they were alone with the billionaire. Adrian sat on a plush leather chair, his head in his hands. His suit was covered in dust and grains of rice. He looked up, his eyes red. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I haven't introduced myself. I'm Adrian. We know who you are, sir, Leo said softly. Everyone knows the name. Why? Hannah asked gently, sitting on the edge of the sofa opposite him. How is a man like you her son? Adrian took a deep, shaky breath. 20 years ago, we weren't rich. We were fleeing the civil unrest in the north. We were on a bus to the border. He stared at his hands, seeing a memory no one else could. Armed men stopped the bus. They separated the women and the children. I was hit in the head, hard. I woke up 3 days later in a missionary hospital with no memory of my name or where I came from. An American couple volunteering there adopted me. They took me abroad, gave me a new life, a new name. But you remembered? Leo asked. Not at first. It took years. Flashes of a song she used to sing. The smell of her cooking. When I made my first million, I hired investigators. I spent a fortune tracking down ghost stories. Adrian looked at Hannah, tears spilling over. They told me she died in the camps. But I felt it. I felt she was still here. He leaned forward, looking at Hannah with intense gratitude. My investigators found her trail last week. But you found her first. You kept her alive when the world threw her away. Before Hannah could respond, a doctor in a white coat pushed through the double doors, looking solemn. Adrian shot to his feet. Is she? She is stable, Mr. Adrian, the doctor said, but she is asking for Hannah. The lower quarter did not know how to handle a miracle. When the black SUV returned the next morning, the air was thick not just with heat, but with gossip. The rumor mill had spun wild tales overnight. Hannah was a secret princess. Hannah was being arrested. Hannah was a witch who had enchanted a king. When the car stopped in front of the food stall, the crowd was already there. They pressed in, necks craning. The mechanic who had shouted at Mama Martha the day before stood with his mouth open, wiping grease from his hands as if trying to make himself presentable. The door opened and Hannah stepped out. She wore her same simple clothes, but she held her head higher. Adrian followed, sunglasses shielding his eyes from a glare. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as they walked to the wobbly wooden table, where Hannah usually chopped vegetables. Clear the table, Adrian commanded gently. Two assistants in sharp gray suits materialized from the second vehicle. They swept away the plastic salt shakers and toothpick holders. With practiced precision, they unrolled a massive set of architectural blueprints, pinning the corners down against the wind. Hannah looked down. The drawing showed a building of glass, polished wood, and steel. It was modern, airy, and beautiful, a palace compared to the tin shacks surrounding it. What is this? Hannah whispered, tracing a line on the paper with a trembling finger. This, Adrian said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd, is the hearth. I bought the land this morning. We tear down this shack tomorrow. In 6 months, you will own the finest restaurant in the city, right here where you fed my mother. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The mechanic dropped his wrench. Adrian, I don't know how to run a big place, Hannah stammered, tears pricking her eyes. You have the only ingredient that matters, Adrian smiled. Kindness. My team will handle the business side until you're ready. He then turned his attention to Leo, who was standing quietly by the washing basin, stunned. Adrian walked over to him, reaching into his suit pocket to pull out a thick, cream-colored envelope. Leo, Adrian said seriously, my mother told me what you did yesterday. You gave a starving woman your only protein and ate plain rice with smile. Leo looked down at his shoes, embarrassed. It was nothing, sir. It was everything, Adrian corrected. He held out the envelope. I made a call to the dean of the City Medical University last night. This is your acceptance letter. Tuition, books, housing, everything is paid for. Full sponsorship until you become the surgeon you want to be. Leo took the envelope, his hand shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. He looked at the university seal, then at his mother, and finally at Adrian, the stoic teenager who never complained about washing dishes or eating scraps finally broke. He covered his face with his hands and wept, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a future that had suddenly, miraculously, opened wide. That night, the celebration in Hannah's tiny apartment was quiet. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, flickering shadows against the peeling paint of the walls. On the small, chipped table sat the cream-colored envelope, the key to a door Leo never thought he would open. Leo read the letter for the 100th time, his fingers tracing the embossed university seal. "Dr. Leo," he whispered, testing the weight of the title on his tongue. He looked up, his eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and pure joy. "Ma, can you believe it? We won't have to worry about rent, or school fees, or anything." Hannah sat on the edge of her mattress, watching him. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It trembled at the corners, fragile as glass. She nodded, reaching out to stroke his cheek. "I am so proud of you, my son." But as Leo turned back to the letter, Hannah's composure cracked. A sob escaped her throat, sharp and sudden. She covered her mouth, but the tears came fast and hot. Leo dropped the letter and rushed to her side. "Ma, what's wrong? Are you happy crying?" Hannah shook her head, burying her face in her hands. It wasn't joy. It was a deep, aching hollow in her chest. The sudden fortune didn't fill the void. It only made the silence where her husband used to be deafening. The next afternoon, the air in the private hospital wing was cool and smelled of lavender. Mama Martha was sitting up in bed, looking stronger. She held Hannah's hand tightly, thanking her for the food. Adrian stood by the window, watching them. He wore a casual shirt today, but his gaze was observant. He had been watching Hannah all morning. He saw how she forced her smiles, how her gaze drifted to the empty chair beside her, as if expecting someone to fill it. "Hannah," Adrian said, stepping away from the window. Hannah looked up, startled. "Yes, sir." "Please, call me Adrian," he said gently. He walked over and sat on the edge of the visitor's chair. "You just became the owner of a restaurant. Your son is going to be a doctor. You have everything people pray for. So, why do you look like you're mourning?" The room went quiet. Mama Martha squeezed Hannah's hand, sensing the shift in mood. Hannah looked down at her lap, picking at a loose thread on her skirt. She couldn't lie. "Because I am," Hannah whispered. "It is not ungratefulness, Adrian. It is just emptiness." "Your husband," Adrian asked softly. "You mentioned you were alone." "I lost him," she said, her voice trembling. 2 years ago, to the cold hands of death." Adrian's expression softened into deep sympathy. "I am so sorry. Was it sudden?" "He was traveling for work," Hannah said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "He was a trader. He went north to buy grain. The police came to my door 3 days later. They said the bus was attacked by bandits. They said no one survived." She took a shaky breath, the memory tearing at her. "We didn't even have a body to bury, Adrian. They said the vehicle burned. We buried an empty box. So now, when good things happen, when I see Leo succeed, it just breaks my heart that Caleb isn't here to see it. He worked so hard for us, and he died for nothing." Adrian listened intently, his face still. But when she mentioned the bus attack in the north and the lack of a body, a flicker of something dark and sharp passed through his eyes. He looked at Hannah, then at his mother. 2 years ago?" Adrian asked, his voice very low. "On the northern route?" "Yes," Hannah whispered, wiping her eyes. Adrian stood up slowly. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He looked like a man who had just heard a tumbler click in a lock. "Excuse me," he said, moving toward the door. "I need to make a call." Adrian did not return to his estate that evening. The heavy oak doors of his downtown office clicked shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the city. He didn't turn on the main lights, preferring the blue glow of his multiple computer monitors. He sat down and pulled up the archived police reports from 2 years ago. Northern route, bus 404, fatal accident, fire. He read the official conclusion. Vehicle lost control and ignited. All passengers incinerated. No identifiable remains recovered. Adrian's jaw tightened. He knew that script. He had almost been a character in it 20 years ago. The incinerated verdict was the perfect cover. If there are no bodies, there is no autopsy. If there is no autopsy, no one realizes that the victims were actually dragged out of wreckage at gunpoint before the fire was lit. He typed in a code to access a different database, one not available to the police. It was a server maintained by his private intelligence network, tracking the movements of the remnant syndicate. He cross-referenced the date of the bus crash with syndicate activity logs. There it was. A transfer log intercepted from a radio frequency in the northern mines. Batch 404 secured. 20 able-bodied males. Transporting to Sector 7. Adrian exhaled, a cold chill running down his spine. Caleb wasn't dead. He had been enslaved for 2 years in the hellhole that Adrian had barely escaped as a boy. He hit the intercom. Marcus, get the team. Now! 10 minutes later, Marcus, a scarred ex-military commando, stood in front of the projection screen. He looked at the police report Adrian had highlighted. Sir, with all due respect, Marcus said, his voice gravelly. This man is dead. His wife buried a casket. The file is closed. The casket was empty, Marcus, Adrian said, standing up and walking to the window. They burned the bus to hide the theft. They didn't steal goods. They stole men. He turned back, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. Caleb is in Sector 7, the mining camp. Marcus stiffened. Sector 7 is a fortress. Going in there isn't a rescue mission. It's an act of war. Then prepare for war, Adrian replied calmly. I want him found. I want him extracted. And I want the place burned to the ground for real this time. Money is no object. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gravity. We move at dawn. A week passed in the lower quarter. The sound of jackhammers had replaced the silence of the morning. The skeleton of the hearth was rising from the dust, steel beams reaching up like fingers grasping for the sky. Hannah stood on the edge of the construction site, wearing a hard hat over her headscarf. She watched the workers pour concrete for the foundation. It should have been the happiest time of her life. She was building a legacy, but the hollow in her chest remained. She found herself looking at the entrance of the site, unconsciously waiting for a man who she believed was ash and bone to walk through it. She didn't know that 300 miles north, amidst the red dust of a guarded mine, a black helicopter was currently cutting through the night sky, carrying men who were coming to rewrite history. She only knew that Adrian had been distant lately, constantly checking his phone, telling her to have faith. She assumed he meant faith in the restaurant. She didn't know he was asking her to have faith in a resurrection. The waiting ended at 3:14 a.m. on a windless Tuesday. Hannah was asleep, exhausted from a day of supervising the tile work at the construction site. The buzzing of her phone against the nightstand sounded like a drill in the quiet room. She jolted awake, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs, a mother's reflex, fearing bad news. She grabbed the phone. Adrian. Her thumb shook as she answered. Adrian? Is it the restaurant? Did something happen to the building? No. Adrian's voice came through, tight and heavy. There was a background noise, like the whir of helicopter blades winding down. Get dressed, Hannah. Wake, Leo. I'm sending a car for you. Now! In the middle of the night, Hannah sat up, clutching the sheet. Adrian, you're scaring me. What is wrong? We found something, Adrian said. He paused, struggling with the words. Just trust me. The driver is outside. The ride to the university teaching hospital was a blur of streetlights and silence. Leo sat beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, sensing the terrified tension radiating off his mother. They didn't go to the main entrance. The driver took them to a private, secured loading bay at the back. Adrian was waiting for them by the freight elevator. He looked like he had been through a storm. His crisp shirt was wrinkled, his sleeves rolled up, and there was red dust on his boots, dust that didn't belong in the city. But his eyes were burning with a fierce, exhausted light. He didn't say hello. He walked straight to Hannah and took both her trembling hands in his. Hannah, listen to me, he said, his voice low and intense. What you are about to see, it defies logic. It defies what the police told you. It defies what you buried. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. What are you saying? We raided Sector 7 tonight, Adrian said. We found men there, men who were supposed to be dead. He squeezed her hands. He is alive, Hannah, but he has changed. 2 years in that place. He is frail. He might be confused. Hannah let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She tried to run toward the doors, but her legs gave out. Leo caught her, his own face pale with shock. "Dad," he whispered. "You found Dad." "Come," Adrian said, guiding them down a sterile, guarded corridor. They stopped at room 404. Adrian nodded to the security detail, and they stepped aside. He pushed the heavy door open. The room was dim, lit only by the green glow of heart monitors. In the center of the room, a wheelchair faced a window. A man sat in it, his silhouette sharp and thin against the city lights. "Caleb?" Hannah whispered, the name tearing from her throat. The figure in the chair froze. Slowly, painfully, he turned the wheels. Hannah stopped breathing. The man looking back at her was a shadow of her husband. His head was shaved, revealing healing cuts. His cheekbones protruded like blades, and his skin was weathered and scarred. But the eyes, deep, warm, and brown, were the same. They were the eyes that had looked at her with love across 1,000 dinner tables. Caleb blinked, squinting through the dim light. He raised a hand that shook violently, his fingers rough and broken. "Hannah?" His voice was a rusted scrape, and used the softness. Is it really you?" Hannah didn't walk. She fell forward. She collapsed at the foot of his wheelchair, burying her face in the thin hospital gown covering his knees. "You're real," she sobbed, clutching his wasted hands. "You're real. Leo." Caleb looked up at his son, tears cutting tracks through the dust still ingrained in his skin. "My boy." Leo fell to his knees beside them, wrapping his arms around the fragile frame of his father. And in that sterile room, the family that death had stolen was finally, miraculously, whole again. The reunion was the miracle, but the recovery was the work. The months that followed Caleb's return were not a fairy tale. They were a slow, grueling climb up a steep mountain. Caleb's body, hardened by labor but broken by malnutrition and abuse, fought to remember what it meant to be free. In the hospital's rehabilitation wing, the days were measured in small victories. A spoon held without shaking. A night slept without screaming. Hannah was there for every moment, but she wasn't alone. Mama Martha, now fully recovered and looking elegant in the silk head wrap she favored, became a permanent fixture at the hospital. The dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the beggar and the giver. They were two mothers who had stared into the abyss of loss and blinked back into the light. "He is strong, Hannah," Martha would say, sitting beside Hannah as they watched Caleb struggle with the parallel bars. "He survived the desert. He will survive the peace." "I worry the peace is harder," Hannah admitted, watching sweat bead on her husband's forehead. "It is," Martha nodded, placing a manicured hand over Hannah's rough one. "But peace is patient. It waits for you to catch up." While Caleb rebuilt his body, the landscape of their past was being cleared away. On a bright Tuesday morning, a yellow bulldozer rumbled into the lower quarter. The neighborhood gathered to watch, but this time there was no panic. Adrian stood beside Hannah, offering her a pair of ear defenders. "You don't have to watch this," he said. "I do," Hannah replied softly. With a roar of diesel engines, the bulldozer's blades slammed into the wooden beams of Hannah's old food stall, the structure that had sheltered them from the sun and rain, the place where she had cooked thousands of pots of stew to keep Leo in school, groaned and splintered. Dust rose up, the same heavy, red dust that had coated their lives for years. But as the shack collapsed into a pile of kindling and twisted tin, Hannah didn't feel sadness. She felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. The wreckage wasn't her home. It was her cage. And it was finally gone. "Make way for the foundation," the foreman shouted. Leo was building a foundation of his own. His first semester at the medical university was a whirlwind of anatomy exams and sleepless nights, but his most important classes happened at home. In the evenings, the small apartment, now filled with better furniture and proper lights, became a second clinic. Leo, wearing his white coat not for status but for utility, would help his father stand. "Left foot, Dad. Heel to toe," Leo instructed gently, his voice steady. He supported Caleb's weight, his young, strong arm wrapped around his father's frail waist. Caleb gritted his teeth, his legs trembling as he took a step across the living room rug. He looked at his son, not the little boy he left behind, but the healer who had returned to him. "You're good at this," Caleb wheezed, managing a weak smile. "I have a good patient," Leo replied, tightening his grip. "Come on, one more step. We're building you back up brick by brick." 6 months later, the dust of the lower quarter had settled to reveal a diamond. Where the wobbly wooden table and tattered canopy once stood, the hearth now rose against the skyline. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the bustling street, framed by polished mahogany and cool, industrial steel. It stood out against the faded tin roofs of the district, yet it did not feel out of place. It felt like a promise kept. The smell of rich tomato stew and spices still wafted from the industrial kitchen vents, but now the aroma was refined, promising comfort rather than just survival. News vans lined the potholed street, their satellite dishes raised high. Reporters who usually only came to this part of the city to cover crime were now adjusting their lighting rigs to capture joy. The flashbulbs popped like lightning, illuminating the crowd of neighbors who had dressed in their Sunday best for the occasion. Adrian stepped onto the raised podium set up at the entrance. He wore a tuxedo, looking every bit the billionaire tycoon, but when he looked at the front row, his expression softened. He tapped the microphone, silencing the murmur of the crowd and the clicking of camera shutters. "Many of you have called this a project of charity," Adrian began, his voice projecting clear and strong. He paused, looking directly into the camera lenses. "You are mistaken. Charity is what you give to those who cannot help themselves. This building is not charity. It is a debt repayment." A hush fell over the crowd. The mechanic next door, now wearing a clean shirt, listened intently. "When I was lost, this neighborhood didn't find me," Adrian continued. "When my mother was starving and invisible, this city didn't feed her." He pointed a steady hand toward Hannah, who sat in the front row wearing a vibrant lace dress, her hand gripping Caleb's. One woman did. Hannah didn't just sell food. She gave life. She restored dignity to a woman everyone else stepped over. This restaurant is not a gift. It is merely the interest on a loan of kindness I can never fully repay. Adrian stepped back, and Mama Martha stepped forward. She was radiant, draped in flowing gold and blue fabric, a stark contrast to the rags she wore when she first sat in the dust of this very spot. She held a pair of large, ceremonial golden scissors. "I will not cut this alone," Martha announced, her voice trembling with emotion. This house was built on the strength of a family that refused to break. She beckoned to the front row. "Hannah, Caleb, come." Hannah stood up, her legs shaking with nerves. Caleb, leaning on a polished cane but standing tall and proud, rose beside her. His recovery had been miraculous, fueled by Leo's care and his own iron will. A cheer erupted from the crowd, neighbors, customers, and friends who knew the hell they had walked through. Leo, standing off the side in a crisp button-down shirt, beamed with pride. Hannah and Caleb walked up the steps. Martha placed the scissors in Hannah's hands, then placed her own hands over them. Caleb placed a scarred, strong hand on top of theirs. 3 hands, the giver, the survivor, and the returned, pressed down together. Snip, the red ribbon fell. The crowd roared. Fireworks shot into the afternoon sky, and the heavy glass doors of the hearth swung open, inviting the world to taste the food that had saved a life. Time moves differently when you are building a future. The 5 years following the opening of the hearth dissolved into a blur of late-night study sessions, clinical rotations, and the steady, rhythmic chopping of vegetables in a kitchen that had become a city landmark. Inside the cavernous University Grand Hall, the air was cool and smelled of floor wax and anticipation. The dean adjusted the microphone, his voice booming across the sea of black gowns and mortarboards. "Leo Keke." Leo stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a sound that echoed the scraping of plastic chairs in the dust of the lower quarter years ago. But his hands were steady now. He walked across the stage, the heavy velvet of his academic hood resting on his shoulders like a mantle of honor. He accepted the scroll, his medical degree. He paused at center stage, shielding his eyes against the stage lights to scan the darkened auditorium. He wasn't looking for the dean's approval. He was looking for his roots. He found them in row G. They were impossible to miss. In a sea of polite applause, A small pocket of the audience was erupting. Caleb stood tall. No cane, no wheelchair. His shoulders broad and filled out. The ghost of the labor camp replaced by the strength of a father restored. Beside him was Hannah, wiping tears from her face with a silk handkerchief, looking every bit the matriarch of a dynasty. Mama Martha was waving a program like a fan, beaming. And right next to them, clapping with the fierce pride of an older brother, was Adrian. They weren't just guests. They were a fortress. A merged tribe bound not by blood, but by a singular, impossible event. Later that evening, the celebration moved to the sprawling gardens of Adrian's estate. Fairy lights strung between ancient oak trees cast a soft glow over the party. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, a stark contrast to the plain rice Leo used to eat. Leo found Adrian standing by the koi pond, swirling a glass of sparkling water. Leo walked up to him, clutching his degree in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. "Adrian," Leo started, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to find the words all day. This paper, this life, I owe it all to you. You paid for the dream." Adrian smiled, turning to face the young doctor. He shook his head slowly. "No, Leo, you have the accounting wrong." Adrian gestured across the lawn. Hannah was laughing at something Caleb whispered to her, while Martha held court with a group of guests, recounting stories of the old days. "I wrote a check," Adrian said softly. "Writing a check is easy when you have zeros in the bank. But your mother? She gave the only protein she had to a stranger when she was hungry herself. She gave shelter when she had no space. She gave love when she had no reason to." Adrian placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "I built the walls, Leo, but she built the foundation. You became a doctor because your mother taught you that human life is worth saving, even when it's covered in dust." Leo looked at his mother across the garden. He saw the way she held his father's arm, anchoring him to the world. He saw the way Martha looked at her with adoration. It was a terrifying, beautiful math. One plate of rice. One moment of compassion in the heat of a forgotten afternoon. It had saved a starving widow, returned a lost billionaire to his family, rescued a father from a living death, and created a healer who would go on to save thousands more. "Roots and wings," Leo whispered, lifting his glass to the woman in the distance. "She gave us roots so we could have wings." Adrian clinked his glass against Leo's. "To Hannah." "To kindness," Leo replied. "It always comes home." And that brings us to the end of this incredible journey. We saw how a single plate of food didn't just fill a stomach. It rebuilt a broken family, restored a lost son, and resurrected a husband from the grave. Hannah thought she was feeding a beggar, but she was actually feeding her own future. But I want to hear from you, our family. What is the biggest lesson you are taking away from this story today? Is it that kindness is a seed that always grows, no matter how dry the ground is? Or perhaps that we should never judge a book by its tattered cover, because you never know who you are actually helping? Drop your wisdom in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to help us grow. Until next time, keep spreading kindness. Stay blessed.